This is the story of Alaska Airlines Flight 1866. On the 4th of September 1971, a Boeing 727 was flying from Ted Stevens International Airport to Seattle Tacoma International Airport, with stopovers in Merle K Airport in Alaska, Yakutat Airport, Juneau Airport, and Sitka Airport. On the ground at Yakutat, the air traffic controller cleared the plane to Juneau. The crew had to take Jet Route 507 to the Pleasant intersection, and then they could fly direct to Juneau. At 11:35 a.m., the plane lifted off from Yakutat Airport. The plane had 107 passengers and 7 crew members on board. At 11:46 p.m., the crew were 65 nautical miles east of Yakutat, and they were at 23,000 feet. The controller cleared the plane down to 10,000 feet, but the pilots had to descend at their own discretion. They had to cross the Pleasant intersection at 10,000 feet. At 11:51 a.m., Flight 1866 started its descent from 23,000 feet. As they descended, the controller asked them to maintain 12,000 feet, but the controller wasn't all there. He was a bit preoccupied. In the skies above Alaska that day was a Piper Apache that was not following its clearance, and the controller was also trying to get the Apache back on course. At 11:58 a.m., the plane was at the Pleasant intersection. This is where they had been cleared to, and they entered a holding pattern. The controller immediately cleared them to the Howard intersection. The controller inquired about the plane's altitude, and the pilots let the controller know that they were at 12,000 feet and that they were on instruments. The plane was right where the controller wanted them. They were cleared to the Howard intersection, but they would have to hold there as well, as they had not gotten clearance to proceed beyond Howard. At 12:01 p.m., still in the clouds, Flight 1866 reached the Howard intersection point, and they started flying the holding pattern. 6 minutes later, the controller checks in with the crew of Flight 1866 about their position in the holding pattern. This was so that the controller could clear the plane in with appropriate guidance. The pilots told the controller that they had just finished their inbound turn and that they were now heading towards the Howard waypoint on the localizer. So the pilots were somewhere along this line, heading towards the Howard waypoint. For the controller, this was perfect. He cleared the plane in for a straight-in LDA approach, and he asked the crew to cross the Howard waypoint at or below 9,000 feet. The pilot acknowledged this clearance, and he let the controller know that the plane was now leaving 12,000 feet. The approach controller kept checking in with Flight 1866 about their altitude. When they were at about 4,500 feet, the approach controller handed the plane off to Juneau Tower. The captain keyed his mic. Alaska 66, Barlow inbound. They were now at the Barlow waypoint, which was 10 nautical miles west of the airport. The controller replied with, Alaska 66, understand I did not copy the intersection, landing runway 8, the wind 080 at 22, occasional gust to 28, the altimeter now 29.47, call us by Barlow. Barlow was a waypoint very close to the runway, and from where they were, they should have reached Barlow very quickly. But that confirmation never came. The seconds ticked by, and at 12:23 p.m., emergency services were put into service to find the missing plane. A few hours later, the wreck of the 727 was found on the Chilkat Mountain, 18.5 nautical miles west of the airport. Unfortunately, no one survived. Before we go any further, let's take a look at how this Boeing 727 ended up where it did. The plane approached the airport and the Howard waypoint from the west. It went into a holding point a few nautical miles before reaching the Howard waypoint. Then it did a 180-degree turn, turned towards the Howard waypoint and the airport, and headed straight till it collided with a mountain at 2,500 feet. This is another map which shows a simplified view of things. You have the crash site itself, the Howard waypoint, the Barlow waypoint, and the airport. From this, it is clear that the plane started descending way too soon. They had not even reached the Howard waypoint, but they were already at 2,500 feet. Before we go any further, let's talk about VORs or VHF omnidirectional range. VORs are beacons on the ground that are used by pilots to navigate. Now think of 360 spokes coming off of a VOR, and each one is numbered, so you have 360 spokes. These are called radials. When you're tuned onto a VOR, you're flying through one of these radials. We'll need this info for later on. The first sign of trouble came when the captain said to the first officer, who was the pilot flying, K, you're Howard, indicating that the plane was at the Howard waypoint, but in reality, they were 9 nautical miles west of the waypoint. The pilots thought that they were further along the approach than they actually were. Since they were in the clouds, they did not have a lot of visual references. The ground was obscured by two layers of clouds at 1,500 and 1,000 feet. The first officer was using his VHF instruments to keep the plane lined up with the airport, and the plane was indeed lined up, so it's safe to assume that his instruments were working. Now the captain was using the SSR VOR to monitor the progress of the plane along its flight path. Now, as the title suggests, this crash has not been solved, but investigators came up with 5 scenarios that can explain this crash, and at the end of the video, I'd like you to tell me which you think is the most probable cause. Probable cause number 1 is a malfunctioning Doppler VOR. Right after the accident, they decided to check out the SSR VOR, and it was working just fine. But during the flight crew said that the Howard intersection was on the 306 radial of the SSR VOR. This was not the case. They were off by about 47 degrees. They made 3 more measurements with respect to a few more points, and those readings were off by 47 degrees and 35 degrees. So the crew were being fed wrong information. If you compare the actual positions and the wrong positions, they were off by about 9 nautical miles. Moreover, if you plot the errors that they got in polar form with its amplitude, then you get 3 points connected by an arc. If you extend this arc into a circle, you get a circle that is centered around, you guessed it, the SSR VOR. VORs are subject to an error called Juneau error, but the error for flight 1866 far exceeds normal errors that we can expect for a VOR system. For example, the average error is plus or minus 1.2 degrees. To see if the terrain played a role, they took another plane into the skies of Alaska. They flew the path again, and no error was observed. They looked at the history of the VOR, and they found no issues. Moreover, other planes used the VOR that day. A Canadian airplane and flight 1866 was tuned to the SSR VOR at more or less the same time, and the Canadian plane had no issues. A few months after the accident, a plane reported a 45-degree error on the Annette VOR, but they could not find any issue with the Annette VOR. But 2 planes did have issues with the SSR VOR, and one was on the same day as the crash, but those were traced to onboard failures, and that brings us neatly to speculative reason number 2. Since the captain was the one navigating, his instruments received extra scrutiny. His ADF and other instruments were reconstructed. The VHF navigation receiver was also reconstructed. It received some serious damage, but they were able to build it back up with minimal parts, and they plugged it into a test bench to see if it worked just fine. His instruments were working fine. Another theory was that the VOR antenna in the tail was corroded, but that turned out to not be the case. They turned their attention to the CDI, or the course deviation indicator. It's an instrument that shows your deviation from your planned path. If a short circuit added a load of about 40 ohms, then that would have brought about a navigational error of about 45 degrees into the system. And if that load were to be increased to about 100 ohms, the navigational error would be about 35 degrees. But if this were the case, the short circuit would have had to take place after they reached the Pleasant intersection, because they had no issues navigating till then. Since the plane was all but destroyed, they could not take a look at the circuitry of the nav system. The third hypothesis is that an external signal interfered with the radios on the plane, thereby corrupting the signals that were received by the plane. But a scan of the area found no signals that could have interfered with flight 1866, and the military said that it had no assets in the region that would have been able to jam the navigational signals of the area. Hypothesis 4 was that there was some sort of fundamental incompatibility between the Doppler VOR and the receiver on the plane. Conventional VOR signals work by having a main carrier signal and 2 sideband signals on either side of the main signal to protect the main signal. The sideband signals are there so that the main signal gets to its destination without changing at all. But it is possible to generate more than one sideband signal by accident. If that happens, it can overlap with other signals and can give erroneous values. Doppler VOR works in the same way, and it is susceptible to this interference, but no interference was found. And it was found that the Collins receiver that the plane used had no issue accepting and filtering the Doppler VOR signal. The last thing we're going to look at are the operational factors to see if something did in the cockpit might have contributed to the crash. The first thing that they noticed was that the crew did not do an audio identification of the nav aid, but this wasn't a big issue. Where things started to get a bit hard for the crew was when the Piper Apache violated its clearance and Flight 1866 had to act as a relay between the Apache and ATC. As the first officer tuned the Juneau localizer, the captain was busy assisting the Apache. As all of this was happening, the first officer asked the captain to tune in the sister's VOR to set the 093 radio. His first request went unanswered. The first officer asked again, "Crank 093 in on yours." This time the captain said, "Yeah." We don't know if the captain did as the first officer told him. This raises the question if there was an oversight made in the cockpit. The captain was really concerned about the presence of this other plane because it would delay his approach into Juneau. Moreover, the captain was consulting charts in order to help the Apache. The captain swore when talking about the Piper Apache, which his friend said was very uncharacteristic of him. So there's a very, very, very small chance that the captain might not have tuned the correct VOR because he was so distracted. Moreover, if the wrong frequency was tuned, there would only be subtle clues in the cockpit to alert the captain to his error. And the captain was manipulating his navigational instruments right up to the point of impact. So in this scenario, he might have been making decisions off of the data of the wrong navigate. But all of this, it's just speculation. Ultimately, the investigative board did not have enough data to unequivocally say that this is what caused the accident. Quote, "In reviewing the different hypotheses, the board concludes that the presently available evidence does not support the selection of any of them as the most probable explanation for the sequence of events leading to the accident." End quote. Whatever happened, something led these pilots to believe that they were 9 nautical miles ahead of their approach than they actually were. So what do you think is the most likely scenario? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. A big thank you to PDX Aviation for letting me use his amazing footage on my videos. I'll catch you guys next time. Stay safe.